said for me to start, so I'll start. Sorry about that. And I'll keep it far away from my mouth because I'm loud as it is. So I'll start with the contextualization. Obviously, we were all here for the screening of Sinners. And one of the important parts of the movie is when the Twin Tails preacher boy, you know, there's a place in Mississippi, it's here in Mississippi called Mound Bayou, where you can be free there. And it's black-owned businesses, it's an all-black town, and we just get that little smidgen of that important story, and then we're kind of left. So obviously, many of us as Mississippians have heard of Mound Bayou and know something about it. But for the average moviegoer, it may not have any resonance, right? First and foremost, as we get started, I am the Mississippian here, but I am from Clarksdale. And so I do want to acknowledge my elders in the room and acknowledge the people who have joined us today from Mound Bayou. So can I get the Johnson brothers, Mr. Darrell and Mr. Herman, to stand up first and foremost?
It's three of us. It's three of us, the baby boys join us too.
Oh, okay, where at?
Joe Eagle. There you go right there.
Wait, thank you. The younger brother I hadn't met, so thank you for being here. But we wanted to make sure that they were here because it's their story, and we don't, far be it from us to tell their stories. But Dr. Garrett Scott is going to give you some historical reference, but I'll just say this to start. Mound Bayou is the promised land in a way. I'm involved with another podcast of Black landowners in Marshall County, and that's the name of the podcast. We are the promised land. And I guess what I want to say is that the narrative, and I love the movie Sinners, but the narrative that is often people here were oppressed, all black people here were poor, all black people here lacked resiliency and agency, and all black people here were docile. These promised lands like Mound Bayou, like Swan Lake, right? Like all these other autonomous or semi-autonomous black spaces, places, and communities throughout Mississippi, which is the blackest state in the union by proportion, exists just as much as the sharecropping area. So we have to fight to, through these types of places, give them their space. So the next movie that I hope Ryan Coogler or anybody makes is to tell about Mound Bayou and all these other black spaces and communities like Harmony and Lee County, all over the state of Mississippi, where black people were resilient, were on top, and ran their own business. And so we're here to highlight the one in the movie, Mound Bayou. So I'm going to shut up, and Dr. Garrett Scott is going to give you some more background about this particular community.
Well, I'm not going to give you a history lecture, but I will say that Mound Bayou was a place where where people said we're going to govern ourselves, we can build for ourselves, we can educate our children, we can heal our sick people. It was one of those. That was the place, and it wasn't alone. I did want to piggyback on what you said, to kind of stress that it may be well known, and now it will be really well known because of this movie. But even just right here in Clarksdale, you have New Africa, where you had enslaved people who escaped and created their own communities and lived, in the bayous along Sunflower River, and then of course after slavery, Africa became New Africa. There was communities where they built schools, built businesses, sold land. And so again, we are really stressing that Mound Bayou is special, but it is not unique in the sense of in a place like Mississippi. And I will also say that I think that narrative that you just talked about, and I don't want to talk too much more. I think that narrative that you talk about the docility and people just allow themselves to have people bash them up against the head, is because it is a narrative that is actually trying to discount the power, the kind of the tradition of Black power here in Mississippi. And I have always, when I teach about Mississippi, like when I was at the University of Mississippi, and even when I went to Tulane, I taught a class called The Search of the Black and Fantastic, and it was about Mississippi. And I, talk about that the Mississippi was the place where kind of the primer of Jim Crow and racial oppression was written through the blood, of Black people. But I believe that one of the reasons that there was such a harsh white backlash is because African Americans were so resistant, that they always, resisted. They never believed, those narratives that they were second-class citizens or that they were things, not human beings. And so the kind of violence that we see here in Mississippi is kind of proportional to how powerful that message was that African Americans, carried, in their hearts and through their children from armed self-resistance.
We will shoot back.
We will shoot back. So from armed self-resistance to, a belief in, God and that they were the chosen people, that they were the promised land. And so I just wanted to make that point that Mound Bayou is special, but it's not unique. It's part of a rich tradition here in Mississippi. It's right here, in the land that we're standing on now, the community that we're in now, and then to, push back too against that narrative and to remember that that narrative emerges in some way because Black people were shooting back, fighting back, showing, in every way that they were not, what these kind of, thoughts about what Black people should be
Dr. Sibley, did you want to add to that any?
Sure. Is this on? Okay, good. So when Rhonda and I were driving to Clarksdale earlier today, when we were thinking about how Ryan Coogler and others represent Mound Bayou as this promised land and how they don't do that with Chicago. And what we're often taught is that the North is the saving grace for Black folks in terms of migration. And it was clear here that the North couldn't be the saving grace because it was still systemically run by white people. And what Mound Bayou uniquely had was self-governance and independence, which was really important. And what I think a lot about as an anthropologist, as someone who teaches about the African diaspora, is we have these wonderful intellectuals of the late 19th, early 20th century, like W.B. Du Bois and like Booker T. Washington and Marcus Garvey. They're theorized, imagining what Black communities could be like when Mound Bayou has already done it. And I think that we often don't think about that as a case study, how to fill in this gap. What does this really look like on the ground? And like Shanette and Rhonda said, in other places as well. But when I think about the work that folks like Isaiah T. Montgomery and Benjamin Green did, is that they were able to understand, especially having had a lot of practice on plantations, how to build a community in the way that you want it to look. And that's a privilege that not a lot of formerly enslaved people had, the ability to imagine what a community could look like for themselves. And I think that's really something, especially in this socio-political environment, that we could really think about as a model for how we move forward in this moment.
what we just talked about in Chicago, what Chicago, wouldn't be the promised land. And that's also, I think, why it's important to talk about placemaking. That the kind of knowledge and things that we need to understand about history are not necessarily things that scholars, write about in books or that you write about in books. But when you focus on the lived experience of people who are making lives in places like Mississippi, like Mound Bayou, then that kind of shifts the narrative away from, or shifts the focus away from the big name, educated leader people. So these are the kind of nameless, faceless people that a lot of stories about the migration say they kind of were these lost souls who, went on to places like Chicago, but then they become more nameless and more faceless as Chicagoans or Harlemites. But when we look at place and the way that place makes communities and institutions and people, then that helps us to kind of be able to recover the stories of people who normally wouldn't appear in the kinds of books, that we read, that are in the libraries, or that we might study in class. So places are really important.
I just had one more comment because as a high school teacher, I always have to remember that everybody does not know what we're talking about. So one of the great points that Jody made about Isaiah T. Montgomery was the fact that they had experience with Black placemaking prior to the end of enslavement. And the reason why is because Isaiah T. Montgomery was the son of his father, who ran the plantation for Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy's brother at Davis Bend. He was so instrumental to the running of the plantation that he got free private education for the enslaved children on the place before the end of enslavement. In fact, he garnered land from the former enslaver, from Jefferson Davis's brother. So when we say that these people came to establish Mound Bayou in the 1880s, late 1880s, they already had the experience of creating and crafting community under the worst of possible things. So when we say they ran that plantation. In fact, let me tell you one ingenious story, because a storyteller is what I am. So Isaiah T. Montgomery's father, when the Union soldiers came to burn stuff, because they did that in many places throughout Mississippi, burned to the ground, Isaiah T. Montgomery's father went to the battlefield, went and found the enslaver on the battlefield, said, they in the area, and they're gonna come and they're gonna burn your stuff down, okay? But I tell you what you do. Why don't you sign that over to me, put it in my name. And so when they come, and they did come, and they said, we should burn this down, it's like, no, this belongs to me. So because he sold the property, he got some of the property. So this is the strategic thinking that bred the Montgomerys that then brought that to Mound Bayou down the road here just a piece. So I want you to be clear that these stories of enslaved people and what they could do during the time of enslavement and after the time of enslavement is a counter-narrative, is a resistant story to the stock narrative that we understand and that is often perpetrated on what Black people in Mississippi can and did do.
I think those are some amazing points. Excuse me. I think those are some amazing points. I think that it's often easy to think of these places as insular, like they don't have connections to other places, or everybody has to know how to do everything. Working like the creative landscape is a similar story here in Mississippi, right? Everybody wants to reinvent the wheel, but one thing I found out leading up to this conversation is that the hospital in Mound Bayou, Mississippi, was actually built by the oldest Black-owned architecture firm in the country, which is located in New York City and still operates today. McKissick, right? So can you all speak to how people were literally building the place, and like what types of material culture are coming out of places like Mound Bayou, or like Swan Lake, or Moundsville, Mississippi, right? Like what types of like things can we actually look to physically, culturally, that resonate with those places?
I'm not sure if I would answer this question fully, but I did want to make the point, first, I just want to make that too important. That Rosalind made, is when we talk about memory. And the other thing I want to say about memory is that one of the reasons that Benjamin Montgomery and Isaiah Montgomery were able to do this because, you know, Jefferson Davis's brother thought of himself as a progressive, you know, enlightened person. And there is also a tendency to just to say things like, well, the Montgomerys experienced a more, you know, lenient or kinder kind of enslavement. But I just want to, but I think it takes away from the ingenuity and the ambition and the drive and the resistance of the enslaved people who learned how to navigate power that other people, you know, so today it might be discounted as, well, they were allowed to do that, or they got an opportunity that others didn't because of the goodness, or whatever they want to say, about about the Davis brothers in particular. And then just thinking about, you know, navigating is so that as the valet, Isaiah, you know, talked to his enslaver about a dream of a black, you know, controlled space. But not to confuse that when they say he got the idea from the, you know, the enslaver, or but to know that he was studying, you know, every movement about how to navigate white power structures in a place like Mississippi, how to finance, how to make connections, how to mobilize resources. So to just always think about, you know, black ingenuity in those spaces. But I do want to say that so Isaiah Montgomery and Benjamin Green were able to, so after they had owned the plantations and were kind of just wiped out, you know, in part by, you know, gold weevils and pests, but also because the Davis family doggedly tried to get those plantations and that land back. Even though they had contracts, they had, you know, paid money, you know, for it, but the Davis family and other white Mississippians, you know, fought them tooth and nail as they saw the ways that they were making that into a successful place. And so, with the failure of the kind of the plantations that Davis did, you know, they didn't give up on the dream, you know, of a black controlled space. And so the railroad, you know, was giving, you know, lands, you know, to people to settle, you know, around railroads. And in that space where Mound Bayou was not populated by whites settlers, but of course indigenous people were there. But you know, they saw it as an opportunity to try to maybe get rid of some land that, well, you know, swampy, full of trees and wilderness and animals. You know, let's just sell it to these black people, and you know, what can they do? And they really clawed out of the wilderness. You know, felling trees and dealing with the swamps and building levees. And then the other point that I really want to make is that black women were right there next to them and beside them. So many of the stories about Mound Bayou, we do hear those two names so much that Isaiah Montgomery's wife, you know, for example, you know, owned her own farm and was known as a tough negotiator, a great manager, one of the finest cotton growers, you know, of herself. I have written about Isaiah's daughter, Mary Cordelia Montgomery Booth, and I talk about the women of Mound Bayou. Her grand aunt was one of her first teachers. And while they were running the store, it was Virginia Montgomery, who was doing the books. Arguably, she probably is the first black woman accountant. She was an enslaved woman doing books, and I know one story too, is that when it came time for them to do the kind of record keeping for the plantation, the Davis brothers would just let the Montgomery men and women have a room to themselves. They're the ones who talk to the surveyors, to other business people, went over the books, went over the banking records with 3 black people, in a little room that was set aside, one of them being a black woman, who was one of the earliest black accountants, here. So the story of Mound Bayou too, I don't want us to forget that. It's a constant story of resistance. So I don't want to play up the resistance so much, but it is something that has to be acknowledged, that almost at every turn, people expected them to fail. And then every time they would succeed, the kind of resistance against the message that their success, the way it challenged ideas about Jim Crow, was important. But to remember that they were able to get this land, but no one really expected them to do much with it. And then look at what they did, and that women were right there with them.
Okay, learned a lot just then. So the next point that I wanted to bring up, because I think it is really important to acknowledge the fact that these people were being cast aside, right? Like with emancipation, it wasn't like, oh, full citizenship. There was a need to create communities that were self-sustaining, at least as much so as they could be. So what does that process look like? I know you talked about building trees. We kind of heard a little bit of the backstory of building community. But what types of skill sets would enslaved people need to have in order to just suddenly be given the opportunity, or create the opportunity for themselves to have that level of agency in community group? What does that look like?
I think that they would have to have every skill set that you could possibly imagine. And you asked about material culture specifically earlier, and even thinking about the history of black architects, for example. Normally, and I think throughout the South and even in other parts of the country, when you have a relatively independent black community, so it could be a community like Mound Bayou that is more self-sustaining, but also like historically black freedmen's communities, they often look to black architects to design and do that work. These weren't always easy relationships, but they happened. And in order to do that, especially when you're talking about formerly enslaved communities, in Mound Bayou, you're talking about people with relatively more resources in terms of skill, sometimes economics, a lot of women doing the fundraising, which was pretty standard as well. You have to have the knowledge of a chemist because bricks have to be made. You have to understand design. You have to understand what it means to apprentice. What does it mean to have all of these folks collaboratively together to do this kind of work? So every hospital, every church, every school that you look at, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of bricks and the labor that just goes into that type of thing that we just kind of see and drive by in so many ways. But I work with the slave dwelling interpretation program. Rondalyn does as well. Shanette was our backbone on that for years. But it's amazing to think about what it means to not only have to take care of a white family's household, but yours and the skill sets to do that, right? And often we think about tangible skill sets, like what does it mean to be able to build something? But what I really like to think about is what it means to be able to read other people's minds and understand what it means to make as little waves as possible, in some cases to be able to get things done. So there's a lot going on strategically for people to build these communities. But I think that it's really, it's kind of difficult for us to maybe understand what it's like to do that when we think about building a house and I have to borrow money to do that, or I have to have a mortgage to get a loan. But what it means to essentially depend on other people to have to get these things done. And I think that's a really important part of the story here.
I think that point is really interesting because now we think about mortgages and going to institutions, right? Where like anybody can go to a bank as long as you have a credit score nowadays. But in that time period, there wasn't a bank willing to give black people loans. Like these people had to invent their own institutions as they were going. Because they didn't exist prior to this. So when thinking about where are people going to school, how are they getting groceries every day? What happens if a fire breaks out, right? Like if my neighbor's house is on fire, my house is now threatened. There are, of course, like these skill sets that are needed. These people obviously were very educated, intelligent people, very enterprising. But what types of social interactions are people having? Earlier, Dr. Scott, you talked about how black women were there, like hand in hand, alongside these men building this community. So what types of like social networks are these people building as they're building this place, as they're like creating Mound Bayou Greek Library?
I know you asked me, but we both talk about, like fraternal orders and stuff and so on.
Dr. Scott will talk about banks in particular because she writes about black-owned banks. But one of the things that I was telling Courtney earlier is African Americans, though they always had some allies and always had a lot of enemies, they did not wait on other people to help them. And I think the narratives that we usually tell in American history are that, oh, there was some benevolent white person, or there was some benevolent whatever. And certainly there were those people, but Mound Bayou is an example, and there are examples all over the state, all over this nation, of African Americans doing things for themselves. And one of the things they did immediately after gaining emancipation is they did a few things. One, obviously, they solidified legally their marriages to the people that they wanted to marry, which is a whole nother subject. They built their own houses of worship and exited white churches that many of them had been forced to worship in. Okay, so that's how we get the AME church and all that kind of stuff. And even here in our own Mississippi soil. And then they wanted to acquire land. There's a quote that I use all the time from a newly freed person in Mississippi. And he says, I just want me 4 or 5 acres or so I can make me my home. African Americans were always searching for home. They always understood they had lost one home, which was Africa, and they were always trying to build and find that place for themselves that they could make for themselves. So the last thing they did is they wanted to educate themselves. For some African Americans, education had existed. Everybody did not exit enslavement illiterate, poor, without property. There are lots of different nuances to our story of emancipation. But they wanted schools, they wanted churches, they wanted their own communities. So often we act as if black community separation and segregation was what was prescribed to us by white people. But we were pretty happy being by ourselves if you would just leave us alone. So there was this push to create these places. And so part of that was racial uplift. So part of that was fraternal orders, racial uplifting. So a lot of times we say with Ida B. Wells, our North Mississippi sister, this idea of racial uplift, also this idea of armed self-defense and resistance, because they created their own burial insurance. They created their own hospitals, 5 or 6 of which here in the state of Mississippi, including the Taborian Hospital in Mound Bayou. started by the Knights and Daughters of Tabor, a fraternal organization, and then built by this oldest black architectural firm in the place that Fannie Lou Hamer died. Okay? So they created for themselves these through institutions and that fraternal uplift, whether it was religious, whether it was not. So Knights and Daughters of Tabor, Papias and Scapion, Knights of Jericho, you name it, because we still have some of those organizations around today. All the burial insurance that we have in the community, all of this is just a remnant of what was created then to take care of ourselves. But since the banks wouldn't give us no money, we created our own bank. On to Dr. Scott.
Yes, and so many enslaved people have been, I always remind you, they have been conversing with the market economy. They had money, they had private banks. These fraternal kind of social orders come out of ones that existed, during slavery. And thinking too about material culture too, and the brick making, one of the first things that they built in Mound Bayou was a sawmill, so that they could build. And so also Mound Bayou is an example of building to build Mound Bayou and then being able for them to leverage that into servicing other parts of so being able to supply, allow other communities, towns, different people in the county to use their sawmill, to buy their bricks, to shop at their stores. But yes, so of course after the debacle of the Freedmen's Bank, I do talk about the Freedmen's Bank, like in my Banking on Freedom book, and the Freedmen's Bank, more than $1 billion of mostly formerly enslaved people's money passed through that bank. In the less than 10 years it was there, it fell through no fault of African Americans, through no fault of African Americans. It had an all-white board that allowed white investors to just use the Freedmen's Bank as a piggy bank. And so what, of course, you had, that's another kind of wealth extraction from black people. So first you had slavery, the hundreds of years of labor that they did not really get, any recompense for, and then they lose generations of wealth. It has a generational effect with the loss of the Freedmen's Bank. And while African Americans were sad and upset, about what happened to the Freedmen's Bank, it convinced them that they needed to have institutions of their own, the institutions that they control. And so among the first handful of black banks that were created, one was created here in Mississippi. And the connection between fraternal orders and black banks is very closely, very like twins. Because these orders were, collecting so much money, they needed safe places to put that money. And so I say all that to say, so we had, so these black banks were created, and to house, another point I want to make, I'm sorry, I got so many things going on my mind. I write about black capitalism. But the point that I want to make is that even as African Americans were learning how to navigate, capitalism, yes, you had some African Americans, it was total self-interest. They wanted to be rich. They wanted, everything that came with, or with having money, of their own. But most African Americans also learned from capitalism that, a kind of a cooperative economics. The idea that, well, if we're going to operate in this capitalist system, we don't want to replicate the same kinds of violence and exploitation that we see around us. Why is it that just one or two people should be at the top, with getting all the riches, accumulating all the resources? Let's spread, the largesse around. And so these black banks were there to build up black businesses, to help people invest, to buy land, especially to buy homes, to buy property. And but they really were a threat, particularly to the crop lien system, because they were providing capital for black farmers to purchase land without having to go to whites. that whereas white people, one of the things you saw in centers was that they talked about that useless money, that plantation money, was wooden nickels, and that money, that was kind of plantation script that they could use, and that white landowners who paid their black workers, not in cash, but in these things they could use for these marked up goods at the plantation stores. Where black banks could give you, this kind of this early microfinance. Black banks could float you a season or two with cash, greenbacks, silver, jangling money, and that was a serious threat to the kind of control that landholders had because they were able to tie and kind of enslave black people to the land through, crop lien and they would work but never be able to quite pay off, so they just add it to the next year and never paying them cash. And so what we have then is that, with every success, there's a backlash. And so even here in Mississippi, it was just kind of a concerted effort to try to really get rid of black banks. And not only would that kind of help to protect the kind of crop lien system, but a lot of black leaders, were connected to black banks, the biggest black farmers, teachers, religious leaders. Those were the people who were investing in the banks, who were on the bank boards. So if you could get rid of a black bank, you could wipe out a significant portion of the black community. So Mound Bayou had a bank, started in 1904, Charles Banks, and so when the state tried to close down that bank, they tried everything that they could to close down that bank. It was so well run, it was so prosperous that they just couldn't. So one day when Charles Banks was away at a National Negro Business League, meeting in another city, the state banking commissioner came in and just closed the bank down while Banks was away. And to let you know how important that bank was, once that bank was closed, then the Masonic Benefits organization couldn't pay any of its debt benefits. And so that was wiped out. And then all the jobs and the businesses that were supported by that black bank. So black banks in Mississippi, were a particular target. Mississippi had, the most black banks. At one point, they had up to a dozen black banks. And for some states, they even had one. They had 12, and they had more than 10. But those black banks were really important because they were a way, they gave black people a foothold in the highest echelons of white power. And so that was a threat that was, they really tried to snuff out because they knew how far, black finance reached into people's homes and their communities, and then generationally being able to leave something behind. But Mound Bayou still, continue to fight.
And I just want to add quickly to Ronald's response and to Courtney's question about one of the first things that formerly enslaved people did, and one of the first things that they did after freedom is search for the family members that they had lost through displacement. And that's something that we could see visibly, especially as historians, through these ads that a lot of them put in papers and other things. They didn't have photographs to show, so you're basically giving a description of your family member and the last plantation you remember them being at. And when we're talking about places like the Delta, which is settled relatively later, or places like North Mississippi, or where I spend most of my time working, some people had already worked on 3 plantations by the time they were 12 and hadn't even met their mothers. So the displacement was so rampant when we talk about this, what we call this a second middle passage in many ways for folks, that this was a very difficult thing to do. And a few people were successful, but unfortunately not many. And I think that when we think about a place like Mound Bayou, it's important to remember that we have folks coming from places like Louisiana who are making conscious decisions to move to a place like Mound Bayou for a better life. For the first time in their lives, they're able to determine where they get to move. No one's forcing them to do that. So I think that that's another lens that we could add to this conversation about Mound Bayou.
I just want to add one more thing. So also too, for those people who are looking, doing your own genealogy, and sometimes you just go to like census records and you kind of get stuck, but it's those kind of records of the ads, letters that people wrote looking for their family members, those Freedmen's Bank passbooks and records. So when people opened accounts, they say what plantation they were from, who were their family members. So there's also genealogical information out there too. If you know the names of the plantations that they were enslaved on, and you can get those people's names in the chancery clerk offices. Whereas you don't have names and census records in those chancery clerk records. That's when someone dies and they're giving away a daughter to go to take care of a daughter that's getting married or moving property. The names and the families are in those kinds of records. So Mound Bayou too is a lesson for going to those spaces, talking to elders, talking to local people if you're looking for your genealogy, but then also to know that these kinds of institutions and these efforts at kind of self-determination is going to be the key to helping many people find their ancestors that they can't find in official government records like the census.
Can I just one thing on that? Sorry. Part of obviously our own history, which is a heritage, tourism, and educational services business, but another big part of what I do is research. And so I spend a lot of time in Mississippi Chancery Court offices. And there's some good records there, but I do want to plug a couple of books that might also be beneficial. So Kenyatta D. Berry, if you ever watch PBS Genealogy Roadshow, I think they were on for 3 seasons. She was the African-American person there. She's a lawyer by training. She grew up in Detroit, but her people out of Virginia. So she is a professional genealogist, and she has a book, a genealogy toolkit. So if you just put in Kenyatta D. Berry, her book will pop up, and it's very, very useful about directing you to these different types of resources that we're talking about that are available to you. And many of the resources are free. I know a lot of us like Ancestry, and past a certain point you have to pay money for it, but there are lots of things that are out there free, and the Chancery Court is just one of them. If you want to know more about what they just spoke on, about this idea of people trying to find their relatives and things of that nature, there's also another book called Can You Help Me Find My Family? And it is the story of both the author's family, but other people who tried to find their family. We know this happened quite often. We know that Ida B. Wells' mother kept writing back to try to find her family in Virginia, if I'm not mistaken, where she was sold down from, by putting these letters into the paper. So this was something, and all of that is public record is available for you if you know where to find it, and they very well help you reconnect with some of your own groups.
All right, at this time, we did want to open the floor for questions. If anybody in the audience had any questions they wanted to ask specifically, or any comment they wanted to make about today's meeting. All right, gentlemen in the back.
My question specifically is for Dr. Gary Scott. Regarding what you're talking about regarding Black capitalism, do you feel like we're moving closer to a more unified vision of Black capitalism, or regressing? Because personally, it feels like our people are a little more reluctant to funding than our white and non-white or non-Black counterparts as compared to the opposite. So how do you feel about this?
So let me preface that question first by saying, I love Black people, so I do not try to criticize Black people. So how I would maybe reframe that to say is that I think that, so Black capitalism, just like Black power, is not a monolithic thing. There are different strains. You have people, this is like it's a continuum. You have, people who, really adopt your kind of cooperative economics, or some people who, want to do away with capitalism altogether. just don't really be on the cooperative part. So I would say, I don't know if I can answer that question as much to say that I think part of the issues that we see facing people who want to try to make money and do good at the same time is that they haven't learned, they don't know, they're not aware of the already rich entrepreneurial heritage and tradition in Black communities and Black history. And so they don't have, and so they are not able to look at all these different kinds of models of ways that people in the past, and in the recent past, have tried to do that, two things, make money and do good, to build institutions, build community, pass on generational wealth. So I would say that too. So I would say that today, that the Black capitalism movement, is just a continuation of the kind of struggle for, Black autonomy, Black freedom, Black joy, where you have people who want to control, who believe that if they can get money circulating back into, African American communities, that we have, so many more choices about, about creating jobs, creating leadership opportunities. When a person is able to, come here to, this coffee shop and they're buying, sourcing their materials from Black-owned companies, Black artists, craftspeople are providing the goods that they are, that they're selling. You have Black authors here on the book, a Black, bond program or finance company, finance the building, or a place like Sip Talk, is bringing in, doing the media and social media and outreach. So I would just say that the Black capitalism has never faded as a strategy toward Black freedom. I think some of the issues that it faces and the stumbling blocks and problems come out of partly because people don't know the rich, entrepreneurial heritage. And because I do think that, Black capitalism is rooted in self-determination and cooperation, the idea of building, community together. And I think that whenever we lose focus on that, any Black capitalist, any Black business person who thinks they're in it just to make themselves rich, and they're not thinking about a heritage that they are inheriting and thinking about ways to pass it on, that's the problem. That's the real problem or the root problem. But I am encouraged by the experimentation, that I see among people in Black capitalism. But at the same time, I do want to say, maybe you were saying something about how Black people don't support Black business, that being the problem.
I said they were more reluctant to give you funding. I didn't say.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, completely not,
Yeah.
able or willing to.
Yeah, more.
It just seems like it's a little more work.
Yeah, but again, I just think that's, just not knowing your history and knowing how much you've been doing this. We've been doing this, and we've shown it to be successful, and the kinds of challenges that we've had to measure, the failures that have happened haven't been because of us, but it's been because, outside forces and being able to recognize that is an important step in just being enlightened.
Can y'all hear? Okay, there we go. Do we have any other questions in the audience? Right in the blue t-shirt.
I have a question for Dr. It's related to tourism. So Clarksdale, their tourism is blues. So Mound Bayou tourism is Black Mexicans. How do you think we can market that for the next generation of youth to center it around Black Mexicans?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and I think that maybe one of the lessons that we really learned from the panel that folks might have been at earlier this morning about the blues economy is thinking about it all as Black excellence and resilience. And I think that, one of the biggest barriers that we have in the state of Mississippi, well, there are several. I'll start with one is getting Black folks from outside of the state to think of Mississippi as a safe space, which I've thought about a lot, and a place that they might feel welcome to. Those who have family who are here know that, but it's a harder selling point outside of that, but also getting Black folks who are here to think about history as not just a story of pain, but joy as well. And it's not just a binary, there's a lot of nuance in that. And I think what we've talked about a lot, at least in this panel, especially through the story of Mound Bayou, is what does it mean to be independent and self-reliant, those types of stories, right? So I don't think that they're that different. And I think that the potential strength of tourism in the state of Mississippi is that we can move people through these spaces as interconnected. Right now what we have is this museum here, this museum there, these folks who are talking about this person here, this person there. And we haven't gotten the state support in many ways, and this is the fault of a lot of our legislators, to develop the infrastructure necessary to bring people here and move them through all of these spaces efficiently. I don't necessarily see those stories as different. I think to the panelists in the blues economy panel this morning, we have to think about reshifting the narrative to other people so that they understand. I know you have a follow-up to that.
But I do like your idea of getting Black people outside of the city to visit.
And yeah, they've got billions in tourism dollars.
All right, do we have any other questions? All right, we have one person right here.
I really appreciate the conversation. I'm wondering if you could give me a timeline. So, for example, you talk about people coming to build Mound Bayou as an intentional community of Black excellence. How long did that take, and what was the arc of the creation of it, and what happened to it?
I would say definitely was one of the things that we see here, especially to piggyback on Dr. Skipper, is it lives in the imagination, of world making. So, in a dream, there two enslaved father and his children, to his children and that they talked about while they were enslaved. And it's important to remember that they didn't know that the Civil War was going to come, in the 1860s. So they may never even have imagined that they would even have had the opportunity to create that world. But once you have a Civil War, and after the failure of the two plantations, it's in the 1880s, early 1880s, that they're able to get the land from to buy the land from the railroad company. It takes them a few years to carve a space out of the property that they have. But by the early 1900s, Mound Bayou is already, it's already known as the jewel of the Delta. As an example around the world, a beacon for what can happen with Black ingenuity. And so even before they even get to the 19-teens, you've got, scores of grocery stores, businesses, high schools, schools, a library that African Americans control. And of course, and more people come, and the founders and people living in Mound Bayou, really promote it as a place that you don't have to go to the north. You can make a life here in the South. And so a legacy of that is that when the Depression comes in the 1930s, Mound Bayou is pretty hard hit. But that spirit of self-determination and ingenuity, makes it also a really important space for that Black, radical, tradition to go on to a new generation. So after World War II, you have veterans coming in, you have college-educated, more, doctors, these professionals coming in, and there's kind of a new wave of, we need, political power, we need a political voice. When during the Civil Rights Movement in the 60s, they were freeing some of people in order to come to places like Mound Bayou because they knew that those were safe spaces. That they, that no Klan was coming up in here, coming up in here. Also, with the Taborian Hospital, Mound Bayou was the site, in the 60s of one of the first community health centers. There were only 2 in the country. Mound Bayou had another one. That was a legacy of that organizing. So it also, it shows that with each, generation of, kind of Black resistance and the fight for civil and economic rights and justice, Mound Bayou is in many ways at the center, in part because out of that dream that a little enslaved Black boy had, and had the bravery to talk to it, to put it into words, and to never let that dream, die. And that dream in many ways was just replicated in, pieces of the old, and being mobilized and leveraged in these new, situations, so that it continued to be a legacy, even up until today.
Wow, so to sort of wrap things out, and I felt to answer this audience member's question, my family actually owns the plantation we were enslaved on, where we started town here in Mississippi, and that timeline is very similar to kind of like my family's roar, like 1860s emancipated, by 1880 we have a town, by 1910 it's bustling, 1920s the depression, things kind of dwindle, by 1950 it's essentially a ghost town. And we still own that land and own that town today, which is kind of why I wanted to sit and kind of hear what you all had to say about a place like Mound Bayou. And again, just to kind of reiterate the point of Mound Bayou doesn't exist in a vacuum. There are so many communities here in Mississippi, like Moundston, Mississippi, like Swan Lake, like Artesia, Mississippi, where Black people were creating their own towns, making their own entire world. And for a movie like Sinners to kind of come and highlight Clarksdale and mention Mound Bayou and kind of give a stage, a platform to these communities, it's important to remember these legacies aren't just something in the past. These are contemporary stories. We are still here in Mississippi doing that work, and this conversation is just a continuation of the work. I want to thank, first of all, our panelists. Again, thank you all so much for that. And Ronnie, you want to shout out to?
Yes, because Black towns and Black communities still exist, and you can visit them, we want you to visit Mound Bayou, but Mr. Darrell, can you tell us the website? Stand up for a second. He's on the board of basically the Alliance for All Black Towns throughout the United States. And so I want you to know it's not just about Mound Bayou, it is about Nicodemus, Kansas. It is about all these other places. And I want him to at least give a shout out to that organization and website so that you can go to it and find out more information about Black towns like Langston, Oklahoma, and other places.
Thank you so much. First of all, let me just say, there was a question that was asked, and I'm going to quickly answer that as well. And that was, what happened to Mound Bayou? I think that's something important everybody needs to understand. And we simply answer that question is, Mound Bayou gave its life. It's real life where people were coming in and running to safety. He gave his life so that people can have other places to go as well. And you have all of these businesses where people were running to, but all of a sudden they started through civil rights and other things running to other places where the doors were open to them. But let me just say thank you. This is our story is an amazing story, and all of our Black towns and settlements have amazing stories in the midst of a lot of darkness that surrounded them. And Mound Bayou in particular, because it was in Mississippi, it was in the Mississippi Delta. Visit us at the moundbayoumuseum.org. All right, visit us at moundbayoumuseum.org and go to our YouTube channel. Everybody, subscribe to our channel. We need some subscriptions. But yeah, we need all of y'all to subscribe. Do that today. But I do want to do one other thing, if y'all will let me. I want to recognize the people that came and people that do powerful things for our museum. If y'all, all of the personnel, the volunteers and all that's here today, my brother, would y'all please stand so that everybody can Alliance, which initially was started with Mound Bayou, Eatonville, Florida, Thompson City, Alabama, Grammy, Louisiana, and Tuskegee, Alabama. We call ourselves the Booker T Towns because Booker T. Washington inspired black people to open up businesses and create towns. And now we have many, 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 many historic black towns across the country. We're working now with other organizations that's helping us gel ourselves to build businesses, to do other things that will be unique to our towns. So stay tuned because there's some powerful things that's happening with that as well. And that is called hbtsa.org.
And one more again.
Historic Black Towns and Settlements Alliance. That's the A. hbtsa.org.
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 We should put a note because they have the barcode right there.
Right now, hbtsa.org. Correct. Thank you, Mr. Dale.
And I also want to say, if you would like one of these lovely Sip Talk t-shirts, definitely go to Sip Talk on Instagram, Facebook, wherever you are, and like them and follow them, because they always do such wonderful, give you so much great things about things that are going on in Mississippi. But there are, a few that are over there for sale. If you would also like one of these from the Sip with Love from Sip Talk.
And I'll just also add that there's a black graduate student at UMass, Amherst, Marcus Smith, who now has a Black Grassroots Heritage Preservation Network, and the Johnsons and their museum are featured in his podcast. So I suggest that you all take a listen to that as well. I'm gonna have to look that up, but if you look up the network, you'll come across the podcast.
And Sip Talk will be featuring those resources as well. Again, special thanks to Macari Roasting Company and Griot Arts Center, along with the city of Clarksdale, and just everybody that had a part in making this happen. Again, follow us at siptalk.com where you can read more about the work that we do in help producing content like this and just making events like this happen. Again, thank you all for coming and hearing what we have to say. Thank you so much.
Very good, very good, very good.
And side note, special shout out to Dr. Derek Scott for these shirts. She like hand pressed these herself. I cannot stress it. Like literally made me cry. She's like one of my personal heroes.